Hi, folks. Oh, hang on.
Yep, good.
Last one on screen. Too much for lunch.
I was counting. Right, let's resume hearing. Mr. Sharman, thank you for finishing your presentation before the lunch break. Just wanted to give you the opportunity to comment on anything that anything of moment that the submitters had to say this morning, since you didn't have that opportunity before.
No, not too much. I mean, I think they were really, I suppose, issues and perspectives that we were aware of and were at top of mind for us. And when I say us, Mr. Black and myself. So not specifically, unless you had a question, sir.
No, it's really just an opportunity for you to pick up any of the matters that were raised that you didn't think you'd picked up on. So, questions. Alan, have you any questions for Mr. Sharman?
Oh, just one point, Mr. Sharman. That discussion you had earlier on restricted discretionary activity status with the chairperson or with Mr. Hill. I noticed too that at para 38 of your statement, you talk about making something a non-complying activity. We obviously have a variance in terms of activity status for various things, but I would have thought what you're trying to achieve by way of a non-complying activity status, you could equally, if not better, achieve by way of a discretionary activity status. And I think to support that view, there's a gentleman by David Kirkpatrick who does a bit of planning work around the traps, who I know fully subscribes to that view of discretionary activity status with a multitude of criteria or assessment criteria. I just wondered if you had a view on that at all, whether non-complying is not really necessary.
Well, I mean, there's sort of two parts to that question or to the answer. So I think, yes, that would be my view. Actually, that discretionary would be perfectly adequate. There are just some things, though, some characteristics of the plan change as it was formulated and then notified that are what they are. And so I suppose we had those discussions actually in caucusing, I think in the planning caucusing, around the triggers and the staging that we have within that really important rule, 3.6a.4.2, and in a way, it elevating non-compliance with it, elevating to non-complying, actually put some more pressure on the rule in terms of our drafting and some of the conversations we were having through caucusing. And so I raise that exact point. I think from the city's point of view, that non-compliance with that rule being discretionary would be a perfectly adequate outcome, but the Green Seed team themselves might want to kind of speak to this point. They wish to retain non-complying activity status, and I think it's really the way that the plan change provisions were framed up, and it was very intentionally done that way. And in terms of some of the activity status, the way it elevates for both the duplexes that we talked about before, and also with the trigger and the staging rule, I think in the end, I suppose I supported the plan change as it was kind of notified in respect of those activity statuses, rather than applied my own kind of position on that.
Okay, no, thanks. That's helpful. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Well, I assume that Ms. Fraser-Smith and Mr. Tyler Marsh are listening to that, so they can respond to that on that question shortly. Shane, did you have any questions for Ms. Sharman?
Most of the matters seem to be resolved.
Yep, I think that's right. I mean, we've got the latest draft of provisions and comments, so I think that's fine. Ms. Sharman, thank you and your team for bringing us to this point. Mr. Modani, have you anything that you want to add?
No, sir. That completes the presentation for the 42A team.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berry.
Thank you, sir. would like to avail ourselves of the opportunity we discussed earlier just to have Mr. Hills and our planners present their very brief statements from this week, given that the issues raised by those are fresh and we have them here. So we may still need to, and probably will need to file some more detailed information from Mr. Hills, but if I could call first on Mr. Hills to just take you through that brief statement and answer any questions, and I'll hand to the planners.
Thank you. Right, Mr. Hills.
Afternoon. So yes, if you can turn to the I think it's called the
further
reply statement.
Yes.
It's the first part. I think is a bit of background, but I might start if I can. Just talking in terms of, I think you've heard today about the potential changes that I've gone through in sort of 2.3 of that statement. Looking at the changes Mr. Black's recommended, the key difference I see now, or the addition, are those two in item 2.3, which relates, I think you've heard today, relates to that 700 dwellings threshold, where the carriageway, in terms of Mr. Black, would increase further from the 7.7 to 9.5. I guess I note, and that's still, I think, in terms of the limit in 2.5, that's still the limit of disagreement in terms of where the provisions have landed. I would, and it's probably a comment today that's come through a bit, in paragraph 2.6, and I think it relates to a lot of what we've talked about today. And this is a paragraph I completely agree with Mr. Black on, in that there are a number of, I suppose determining the exact trigger is difficult in terms of future. In my opinion, the initial 500 dwelling threshold, which I've talked about today, I think that's reasonably, we can reasonably be certain of that. And that is an upgrade after the 500 dwellings or the access onto Burbush. And I'd just like to point out that upgrade is it's not at that upgrade that Burbush and Xalby can't operate anymore because of capacity. It is simply a change in, I suppose, the nature of the road, and really the change does relate to safety, just to point that out. And that's why the upgrade was there. But after that, in item 2.7, in paragraph 2.7, I've listed those through there. To me, there are a number of, I suppose, less knowns in the future, and basically assumptions that make some of the numbers that Mr. Black talks about, and I think he acknowledged it today, that are sort of worst case scenarios in relation to both traffic generation, traffic on that road, particularly, which in my opinion are best considered in the future through ITAs, and I'll talk about that in a minute in terms of the changes we're proposing regarding that. In terms of, at the time, these variables in the future, when you come to actually look at developments, and including what's happened, what's about to happen, you obviously have a lot better understanding of the nature of the surrounding network, as well as the own one you're assessing at the actual time you do it through subdivision resource consent, where those future ITAs are required. And at 2.7, I just listed some of the, I suppose, variables. I know Mr. Black commented on item B in particular. Following Mr. Black's 42A report, I adopted his 15%, but I think he's gone back to the 10% now, which rates to the daily versus peak hour. I don't think I'll go into that too much detail, and to say that that sort of demonstrates a little bit of the variability that you do get, which can be as development occurs, particularly as on roads such as this, you can get a better handle of that exact number for future ITAs. And so in 2.8, that's where I've recommended that these, I believe that the future integrated transport assessments can deal with Mr. Black's concerns, rather than having a hard and fast trigger rule that might actually I guess not be warranted, but also say just to bear in mind these upgrades we're talking about are in all the cases really, or particularly the mid-block ones, are basically interim upgrades. This area will be urbanised in the future, and I suppose to put in a 9.5 metre, what is effectively an arterial road, I suppose rural road, and then come and rip it up in the future, to me, if it's not needed, seems a complete waste, really. So in terms of that, in item 210, I've recommended a couple of changes, particularly the first one, as originally drafted, and that's an A, 210A, as originally drafted, it referred to broad ITAs, and I suppose the concern I had there in talking to our planners was that the broad ITAs only really kick off after about 150, I think it's 1,500 vehicle movements, so 150 dwellings. So there could be a potential that the items within this broad ITA is effectively they're missed. So I think it should apply to any ITAs that occur in the future. And in B, there was the additional, I suppose, criteria Mr. Black, I think, mentioned today regarding Exelby and Lee Road, which is another item to specifically consider in the ITAs going forward. And so that's in terms of concluding comments, particularly, you know, as I've mentioned, I still consider the issues identified by Mr. Black are best addressed in future ITAs, particularly regarding some of the variability that is going to occur in the future in an area like this. And there's nothing that's in Mr. Black's evidence other than the comments on those previously that's changed my position.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hills. Just a question for you on the ITAs. I think one of the points I picked up from Mr. Black this morning was, I think he indicated a concern that as to who would be addressing the sort of the cumulative impacts of multiple small scale developments within the plan change area. And obviously a concern that if you're only building, you know, if you're only doing, I don't know, 12, 15 lots or something like that, then, you know, the ambit for your consideration would be a good deal less than looking at what otherwise might be a broad ITA, I suppose.
I agree with that. That's one of the exact reasons I wanted the broad term removed. Mm-hmm. So it's any ITA. There's always going to be the odd development with, you know, as you say, 10, 15 lots in my experience and other developments, but, you know, that possibly you go under that radar, but they do tend to get picked up once you do a larger one. But that was exactly the reason I wanted the term broad removed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Alan?
You know, I think that picks up on most of those points as such, apart from, you know, the further evidence and rebuttal that we'll be receiving in that respect. Certainly highlighting, there are a number of details that Mr. Black raises that can be left to ITAs. I guess it's always, and it's probably a perennial sort of comment of mine, it's leaving those sorts of, you know, comments or evidence of some substance to later processes and having the faith that those processes have the capability of picking up on them. You know, witnesses are always keen to leave things to future processes, but, you know, quite often they're not going to be involved in that process. We need to have the confidence that the ITAs will actually pick up on those things. And as the chair's just indicated, there will be subdivisional proposals that won't require an ITA or won't get picked up. But, you know, you don't need too many cars to create a major problem in terms of accident potential and the like. But I guess we'll hear further from you in terms of some of that anyhow.
Yeah, just one comment on that, if I may. Yes, I agree with that. I think in this case, I think there's no question there is an upgrade required, and that's why I'm you know, still that upgrade at 500 dwellings, you know, it's not like everything's been pushed, I suppose, to that future ITA, and it is a balance. And to me, there's no doubt that at 500, you're around that number, or an access onto Burbish, we need an upgrade. There definitely needs to be an upgrade. It's just those future ones beyond that. To me, there are so many variables that it's more appropriate to go to that ITA stage later. So that's where my position lies, I guess.
Mm. How much is in your comment that you made earlier on about, if the upgrading was required to be to a standard of 9, when to say standard, a road width of 9.5 metres or whatever instead of 7.5 metres, and you talked about, and I think your wording was to be ripped up at a later date with roading associated with a fuller urbanisation. I mean, isn't the counter to that the fact that this applicant's wanting to jump the gun on development? In fact, I wrote down what Kay Moroney said. She made a little bit of a quote along those lines earlier on. I mean, how much sympathy would a decision maker have for an applicant when they're wanting to jump the gun on the sequencing of development anyhow?
Oh, yes, I agree with that. And I think my comment regarding that, I suppose, of the 7.5 metres versus 9.5, to me stands alone without that. But yes, I do agree that, yeah, that was that's in reality, that's what potentially will happen if we go to 9.5 and then have to rip it up. But you're right, in terms of how much regard you have for that, probably very little, I'd thought. Yeah,
I guess at the end of the day, the main determinant is, traffic safety. And I think you yourself or one of the traffic witnesses said, one deadly accident is worth avoiding, and that might be the cost of it.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that. And that's particularly serious and fatal crashes, as Mr. Black pointed out, are the key.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, David.
Just come back on the on that matter. I mean, I'm just thinking aloud here as we move through. But would you have a problem, Mr. Hills, with if you took that 700 dwellings as a trigger for an ITA to specifically look at whether those particular upgrades on Ixelby and I think it's 1A and 3A of Mr. Black's proposition. Yeah, it is 1A and 3A. Yes. Whether it's a trigger point for a different sort of ITA.
Yeah, I think, from my point of view, if I was doing the ITA, and I think Commissioner Watson's right, it might not be me, it might be someone else, it could be anyone, and you don't know who it's going to be. Yes, I think that would, those items under that ITA specifically include that road, but maybe not to that degree of specificity in terms of, so I personally wouldn't have an issue with that, no.
Well, have a think about that in terms of where you're coming back on the other issues. And I mean, you may have a conversation with Mr. Black or not as well, and come to a position on that, or Mr. Sharman. I'm not sure who it's with, but anyway, let's just leave that dangling as a thought. Shane?
No, your reply was clear. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Hills. I don't think you had a supplementary piece of information, but I don't think we need to go into that, do we? Oh no, that was just the table 2, right?
Yes, that was Mr. Fraser Smith helped me prepare that as well, sir. I think you gave me a lot of credit for that. But yes,
I've got a much better table in front of me as the one I made, so yeah, that's fine. Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Hills. And so are we now going to hear from Ms. Renee? Well, which one of your planners, Mr. Barry?
Please. Mr. Ptolemy, sir, first, please.
Okay.
So your previous comment, that is an interesting point in terms of the ITA having a trigger clause within it. And I think that can actually be drafted potentially so it accounts for the cumulative, i.e. what required consent and had an ITA, what was small scale. So you're never in a scenario where you are dealing with someone coming in and saying, I'm less than minor effect, because the information requirement, the assessment is triggered at a certain yield, regardless of that.
And the only, I guess the only comment you might want to have a think about is whether that might act as a disincentive, anybody coming forward between 650 plus.
That is always the issue for triggers. Inevitably what it is, particularly given that there is one developer controlling a large interest in the site. So if you had, as we've seen with other sites, 20 or 30 developers, it's the rush to get in first or last. quite different when you have someone controlling a large land holding who can actually plan and sequence things because of that control, that integration. And that's what when you went out, that's what you saw when you went out to Drury, is one developer being able to control about 160 hectares, and therefore the ability to forward build key infrastructure is a known quantity.
Yeah, no, accept that.
I think just carrying on, so just a clarification in terms of what Mr. Sharman outlined. On these matters of the transport triggers, the notified plan change had a discretionary activity status and it had a smaller list of required infrastructure. So it wasn't non-complying as notified. The non-complying activity status was a request of the council officers themselves. And when you've got a very small prescribed list of infrastructure, again, that you know is going to go in, it's been agreed to, you know that's part of the mix, it's a known quantity, it's very easy to, as a planner, to say, yeah, that's a reasonable commitment that you can make in terms of an activity status, because it's known. Where I've become more concerned, and you've seen that with the evidence regarding triggers that are based on variables, they're based on assumptions, they're based on a what if no one in Drury South develops, arterial roads do not get built. Your Rotokauri South,
That's right. We thought we'd heard this before.
So the difficulty of that is when you're dealing with non-complying activity status based on something which is catch-all for uncertainty, it becomes very difficult when you get into a statutory argument down the track that the circumstances changed because they're unknown, the scenarios changed, the timings changed. That's where a discretionary activity is much easier to manage because you can reasonably go through those assessments and tests. So the approach that we've taken based on the 2 points are outstanding. So I think it's fair to say the other matters, we're not disputing the other matters in table 1 and 2, that they've been agreed through JWS. It's those 2 points outstanding. It's far better to incorporate that into an ITA, which will get prepared at the date of resource consent assessment. It could have a trigger within it itself, which escalates the parameters, absolutely. That takes into account what is known at that time in the future, which could be 5 or 10 years off when that's actually triggered. The difficulty I have is looking at even between Mr. Hill's, Mr. Black's evidence. They've used different data sets, they've used different assumptions, they've used different ratios, if I can use that word, it's probably not correct, to get to whether it's 700, 500 or 1,000. And that's not getting that, where it's much easier to say, here's the things that need to be looked at about this point, because they're really important. We don't know whether the effects are going to be triggered at that point or whether it's a concern or the environment is like this, but we allow a point in time for that assessment. And I think what that does is it doesn't take away the concerns that have been raised. I think that's the key thing. It's not avoiding those concerns, but it's putting a reasonable assessment parameter around that. Now, obviously, ITAs require restricted discretionary activity consent. On the discretions that are associated with that, they're extremely broad. They encompass all the things that you would acknowledge around transport. So for transport purposes, they're effectively fully discretionary, but obviously they are focused on the transport matters. I think that's actually potentially a very reasonable way forward. The concern around not complying is it is a step too far if you are in a scenario where you need to apply for a non-complying activity, but you've got an effects-based or a policy-based threshold to meet, and there are circumstances outside of Green Seed's control.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd go somewhere different anyway, because with an NCA, I'm very hard, unless it's a major variance from what's set out here, you're going to rush through the policy and objective test in any event.
I think with these, you've seen that the objectives and policies are very focused, they're very pronounced, they're on point, they're not broad, avoid, remedy, mitigate effects. They're very much about necessary upgrades, having certainty on those upgrades. So yes, the broad transport section of the plan has some very wide sweeping statements around that. I see that the objectives and policies that have been brought into play with this structure plan are more specific. And there is the ability to potentially say, well, there could be a direct conflict there, not because of an effect or not because of the environment, just because we, in 2021, identified a trigger at this point.
Well, if that's the case, then it one presumes then discretionary would be the correct one. If I mean, I don't necessarily agree with you yet. I haven't actually thought through that issue in detail. But if it's your view that the objectives and policies are type such that one would not get through that particular test and you'd have to rely upon the effects assessment, then unless you're going to a quasi-prohibited activity because the effects would not be less than minor if it was substantial, then discretionary would seem to be the obvious one. But anyway, that's not my argument at the moment. I'm just...
I think in terms of there are a number of options to address these two outstanding matters. And I see if one is the activity status, the other is to actually have that information requirement, obviously tied to the discretions, which is much more reflective at that point in time. And maybe that a cautionary approach can be applied to where that trigger point sits, because it's not necessarily requiring as a performance standard, you must build this. It's more, we need these evaluations, and it could be in a stepped way to understand what is happening in that environment. And I think
I'm also mindful, in that we're talking transport at the moment, I'm mindful that Mr. Hills was clearly signalling that he didn't think that for a temporary solution, an expansion to 9.5 metres was justified. That's what I took. He might come back and say something different, but that's what I took out of his comment from earlier on today.
If I can, what I see could be a scenario is that when you suddenly reach these trigger points, the council and the developer come together and say, it's actually better for us to pool our resources to get this 1.5.
Yep. Well, I wasn't going to ask you what's in the PDA, but it did occur to me that is a vehicle that could be used. Yeah. So I take Mr. Hill's point. It is a terrible scenario, and I've seen it a couple of times where we've built a bridge which is literally ripped out of the ground 2 years later, and the bridge costs. Oh, except the bridge to nowhere is actually quite famous.
Yes. So the difficulty is when you've got a DA and you've got a process to actually inform that, you can actually logically get to that point. If you've got a set standard which says it's 7.5 metres, 7.7 metres, that's it, and you try to waver outside of that to get a better outcome, you could very easily, with drafting, and I think Mr. Sharman acknowledged, end up in a non-compliant position pretty quickly, where you're actually trying to get to a better outcome. DA, I think, allows and supports that outcome, that step forward.
Yep.
What that probably concludes is Ms. Fraser-Smith and I in 2.5 have proposed an extension on the ITA in terms of, it's not broad, it's an ITA. It includes the intersection and contention. I believe what we could do is add to that as a mechanism, as an alternative to those 2 points in the actual table, which I think we're comfortable for table 2. What remains there is a non-complying activity, and then these elements would be a very specific ITA trigger and requirement.
And just remind us, the requirement for an ITA kicks in at what point?
50 units.
Does it always kick in for any scale of development in the plan change?
A very simple one is only 50 units.
So it would be 50 units, 50 lots. Is
right. Yeah, I thought there was a number. I wasn't sure what it was. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are for subdivision, there's still transport as a matter of discretion for all subdivision activities. I believe what that ITA rule could do is actually require if it had internally a trigger point, that is a cumulative measurement. And so, yes, it would be that application that comes in has to actually address that, but obviously it also applies to all subsequent applications as well. So, you know, until the actual outcome, the physical works are complete.
Yeah, no, recognise that. You might have all sorts of ones that are approved but not developed on the land. That's right.
And I think that way, you don't, for example, in that scenario, you'd have, under the current drafting of the rules, you'd have all those subsequent applications also being non-complying until that end state is reached, as opposed to potentially a discretionary route. You work through, are we actually at the point where that's required? Has development in Rotokauri South, for example, resolved this intersection issue? Because that intersection issue sits in Rotokauri South. It sits as part of that development area, and the assumption that no development could occur in Rotokauri South, where it's directly enabled, they can apply for consents tomorrow, it is something I think also supports the proposition that a discretionary status for a out of Rotokauri South party to have to consider those factors is more appropriate, because we could end up with a perverse outcome that Rotokauri South remains undeveloped because these quite expensive infrastructure costs are actually sitting with Rotokauri North.
Yep.
I think, so that's something in terms of working with Mr. Hills, we can put a provision forward and that would be effectively an expansion on our paragraph 2.5 of the supplementary.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Talmash. And I take it Ms. Fraser-Smith's got nothing to add to that. I think she already added.
No.
Yeah, right. Alan, any questions of Ms. Talmash?
No, that's all fine. That's clear. Thanks. Thank you.
Shane?
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Berry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we, if we were going to present a reply, it would be pretty much the conversation we just had.
Yeah.
So I don't propose to do that. So as we foreshadowed last week, our preference would be to file a written reply, and also with that will be the amended provision that Mr. Tolmash was just talking about, and some further evidence from Mr. Hills. So this entire team has a hearing pretty much like this one next week. And so whereas I've normally asked for 5 working days, I'm asking for 10, sir. So it'll be Friday, a fortnight from tomorrow.
That's fine. I've got a 4-day hearing next week too. I hope it's not the same one, is it, Mr. Berry?
I don't think so, sir.
No.
Mine's on the North Shore. Yours, I think, is on the South Shore.
I couldn't remember anything about minibus transport or anything like that. So I was thinking maybe I'd forgotten some part of our case.
But no, that's fine. I think 10 days certainly isn't a problem for us. And if for any reason that's not doable for other matters, just come back to us with a further request on that. I mean, we still have to conduct a site visit, and I don't know quite when we'll be able to do that. I guess if we can't do that within a month, we will forego it basically in order to formally close the hearing. But I don't know if anybody's heard whether there's any updates today that we need to be aware of. Steve, have you heard any updates?
The changes are pretty well keep it going till next week, so just pushing it out again.
Right. Okay. All right. So, Alan, Shane, is there anything else that you want to comment on? No. All right.
No, all good by me. Thanks.
In that case, thank you everybody who's tuned in today. Particularly, thank you submitters. I'm sorry that you couldn't get together all within one bubble, but that's just how it is today. But thank you for your participation, and we're adjourned until you hear from us, and we'll receive some the information that Mr. Berry's signalled within a fortnight, and that will be distributed And we'll then tell you at what point we formally close the hearing and move to deliberation. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chair.
And you can tune out.